the Brown Pundits Browncast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brown Pundits Browncast. My name is Maneesh Taneja. This is the third episode in our series of podcasts on the history of the Indian subcontinent. This episode is about the Indus Valley Civilization. What do we know about IVC and what are the missing pieces? Our speakers for the episode are Razib Khan, Mukunda Raghvan, Shrikantha Krishnamacharya and Gaurav Lele. Welcome to the episode, gentlemen. What do we know of the Indus Valley Civilization? When does it start and what are its geographical expanse? Mukunda, would you like to start on that?
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm not an expert on this. I've read a few articles and things like this, but I mean, I think they see the rough period of urbanization of the IVC is roughly from about 2600 to about 1800 BCE, right? So 4,500 years to 3,800 years before present. But obviously, there are layers that go back further, and there's a lot of discussion on what the nature of the IVC was. Gaurav sent a fantastic article yesterday that goes into a deep dive on whether IVC as I guess, it's tough to say as a culture or civilization, as we want to call it, was whether it was stateless, whether it was not, whether it was hierarchical, or was it just very uniquely based on some level of mass equality. So we have a lot of material data in the IVC, for example, like pottery and terracotta figures and physical structures of the town layouts, but we don't have much sense of what the cultural milieu and the cultural world or the literary world of the IVC is, because we haven't obviously deciphered any of the signage or what do we call it? The closest analogy with hieroglyphics of the IVC culture. So we don't know what they spoke, what they believed in, what their society was based on. We have a sense that first of all, most of the cities seem to be very, very well planned, and the well plannedness, I think, from our current understanding, is a very deep layer. It predates much of the urbanization phase of the IVC. So even when these were settlements or villages or smaller towns, whatever you want to call them, they were very highly regimented in the town planning and layout. They were built in rectangular, like grid patterns. They seem to have very, very ancient sewage systems or waste disposal systems built into the city, which is a fantastic marvel. Another interesting thing about IVC on the whole is we don't find any large structures, whether you want to look in the ancient world of whether the Babylonians or Sumerians, more accurately, the Akkadians, or even the Egyptians. We don't find massive temples or palaces or structures of that way. So there is IVC is a weird mystery because it seems to be kind of unique amongst all the ancient civilizations in its both material culture and what it seemed to have in terms of landmass. Right, it was vastly larger than any other civilization at that time by factors, right? So the landmass was huge. Whether you go all the way from parts of Afghanistan into the deep heartland of what is India today, right? Before the Ganges on the western side, it's pretty massive. It's a massive land. It was both landlocked and it was naval ports, and so we know there's massive trading and so on and so forth. So I do think that the IVC culture and civilization is a unique spot for us to think about and to discuss. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Razib, your thoughts?
Yeah, I've read a lot of the same stuff as you, Mukunda. It's pretty it's really huge, and it doesn't seem to be stratified. Like I don't think people know what the hell's going on. It's super weird.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Shrikant, your
Right,
thoughts?
because because most other civilizations like Egypt's had pharaohs, even as far back as you go back to like the first kingdom in the Egyptian kingdoms. They had some sort of hierarchical structures that were clearly demarcated in their physical in their physical layouts of their cities. And I do find that be very interesting. Although the IVC did have certain houses and certain areas that seemed to be slightly bigger, they weren't not necessarily like the
massive.
huge differences that we see in other parts of the world.
Shrikant, your thoughts?
Yeah. So when we discuss IVC, right? First of all, the very nomenclature, Indus Valley, it's a bit of a misnomer. As Mukunda mentioned, it's a fairly massive civilization, right? We're talking about more than 1 million square kilometers, ranging all the way from Upper Punjab all the way up till northern Maharashtra, right? It's pretty massive. And there was a study done by Michel Danino, who has one of the people who's kind of invested in studying the mature Harappan sites. There are over 1,100 sites that he has studied, and he's noticed that only about 37% of them are in the Indus Basin, right? And the rest of them are not in the Indus Basin, and yet we call it the Indus Valley Civilization, right? So many of the sites were actually in what is India proper today, within the boundaries of modern day India, right? On the banks of the Saraswati River, which is no longer an existing river, it has dried out. So, yeah, I think that's something to bear in mind, right? So the Indus Valley Civilization is not necessarily exclusive to the Indus Valley, it's pretty massive. The southernmost site, I think, is in Maharashtra, the Daimabad site. And then the northernmost site goes all the way up to the Oxus River, right? The Shortugai site, which is, I think, a late Harappan settlement. So it's pretty large civilization. And also, as Mukunda mentioned, it's a mute civilization, right? We have not deciphered the script. There's much that is unknown. And also, much of the sites are located in areas that are now very densely populated, right? If you talk about Haryana or Western UP, these are extremely densely populated today. And as a result, excavation is extremely hard, right? Rakhigari is one of the largest Indus Valley sites, and it has only been partially excavated. There is speculation that it could be as large as Mohenjo Daro, but then excavation cannot proceed because it sits underneath a lot of villages, densely populated villages. That's the other challenge with IVC, right? And and as I mentioned, there's much that is unknown about IVC. We don't know why the culture ended around 1900 BCE. It seems like many of the sites were abandoned at pretty much the same time, 1900 to 1500 BCE, right? I think about 50, 60 years ago, I guess the invasion was regarded as the primary cause, which is kind of less popular nowadays, right? Could it have been the drying of the Saraswati River? Maybe, but having said that, even cities like Mohenjo Daro were abandoned at pretty much the same time, right? Even though Mohenjo Daro is not on the banks of Saraswati, it's on the banks of the Indus, right? The Indus still flows in the region where Mohenjo Daro ruins exist. So we don't have a great deal of clarity in terms of why the Indus Valley civilization declined, right? And that's still a question that needs to be answered.
Yeah, can I just jump in here real quick? So obviously we don't know for sure, but I've been reading actually a lot about the paleoclimate for unrelated reasons. There was pretty clearly a climate shock between around 2150 BC, all across Eurasia. So we know this from West Asia because we have writing from the end of the Akkadian Empire in early Ur-3. There's a massive climate shock, migration of these people called Gutians from the Zagros. This is also the end of the Old Kingdom. It turns out, recently they've discovered that there was a relatively complex Neolithic society in northern China, northeast China, and it collapsed right at this time during this climate shock. And so I think it's quite plausible that these early Bronze Age civilizations, who, they're much more fragile than we are used to thinking with like the, like let's say Iron Age civilizations. They routinely collapse and they forget all about themselves. So, for example, at the end of the Bronze Age, the Greek civilization, the Bronze Age Greeks collapsed. And when they show up 400 years later, they had forgotten that their ancestors made all these cities and everything like that. There's just legends of these monsters that created these citadels. It turns out that the monsters were themselves Greeks, and we only know this because the various ways they translated the tablets in Linear B, which like they had forgotten how to write. And so these people had forgotten themselves in 400 years, and only modern archaeologists and historians have figured out, oh, they were Greek speakers too. They even worship the same gods because you can see who they sacrificed to. And so these Bronze Age civilizations, like they tend to collapse like really quickly because they don't have the cultural systems of like, for example, Roman Empire collapses, but the Roman Catholic Church is still here. Right? There's nothing like that in most of these civilizations. The exception I can think of off the top of my head is the temple system in Egypt actually continued continuously from say like 3000 BCE down to 500 AD when they were finally shut down by Justinian in Philae, right? So some of these religious systems can continue for thousands of years, but without writing in particular, there's these disruptions. And second thing I want to say is I am like quite confident that the Indus Valley Civilization was multilingual. Because that should be your prior. Every other civilization except for Egypt that we have writing for was multilingual. So the Mesopotamian civilization had multiple languages. Sumerian, which is unrelated to all the others. Right to the east, there's Elamite, which is unrelated to all the others. Then you have Akkadian, which is Semitic, is distantly related to Hebrew. You have Assyrian, you have New Babylonian, you have Amorite, etc., etc. The Hittites themselves, most of the people did not speak the Hittite language, the Neshite language. They spoke Hatti, which is a non-Indo-European language. The Mitanni, they seem to be speaking Hurrian, which is not Semitic or Indo-European. So all of these, so maybe India is different, India's subcontinent, maybe they all spoke the same language. I don't think they did. One reason I don't think they did is in northern Pakistan, we have the Barusho people who speak a language unrelated to any other language of the world. And then like the linguists tell me, or they say that a lot of the toponyms in the Gangetic Valley, especially from say like Delhi eastward, there's just like very little evidence of Dravidian substrate. So like like what were they speaking there and who was showing up there? Whereas in Maharashtra and Gujarat, these are Indo-Aryan speaking areas now, but the toponyms are Dravidian. Maharashtra, the Marathi language in particular, has a clear Dravidian substrate, and it's like it seems to have come out of creolization, et cetera, et cetera. And then like the last thing I'll say is from genetics. It's quite clear, like I said, if you look at the quote ancestral North Indian, people in Sindh, in Gujarat, and Maharashtra, they're really, really enriched beyond what you would expect on a regression model for IVC, quote, IVC component ancestry. Whereas like, people in the Gangetic plane, they have less IVC and more steppe. And so that suggests to me that this early period, there was like I wrote a blog post about it. Maybe you guys can post it. Like they call it the Aryan integration theory. Like the Sangam poetry has Sanskrit influence. Like the earliest Dravidians languages that we have Sanskrit, Indo-Aryan, whatever influence, right? I don't think that these two groups were very separate. I think they emerged and expanded together. And I think the Dravidian speaking groups expanded southward only a little before really the steppe incursion, and really it was pretty much simultaneous. And we see this with the genetics where like Reddies have 5% steppe ancestry. By the way, Reddies also have a lot of IVC, like a lot. So I mean, it's like some of these like peasant castes in South India have a huge amount of IVC ancestry. Like how did that happen? I don't know. But like Reddies, Patidars, and Sindhis, for example, they all show up like really, really strongly on IVC. And then you see groups in like the Gangetic Plain who have less IVC, but they have more steppe. And there's these like more subtle patterns that we haven't really explored. That geneticists haven't really explored, partly just because there's just these big questions that they're basically looking at right now. But I think the initial expansion phase where we don't have writing, so we just have archaeological stuff, I think there's like details in there where it's not just a generic expansion from a homogeneous civilization.
Yeah. Just a few comments there. With respect to the Indus script, The Indus people were very laconic, right? They have not left behind large inscriptions, like unlike say Sumerian civilization, right, or Egyptian civilization, right? So even the seals that survive, typically they are very short, right, with 4 or 5 signs. I think the longest inscription that we have from the Indus Valley is around 23 signs. Now, with respect to the language, I think that there can be a few hypotheses here, right? It could be a Proto-Dravidian language. That's one hypothesis, which is pretty popular. But it's been pushed by academics like Airavatam Mahadevan and also Asko Parpola, the Finnish Indologist. There's also a minority view that it could be an Indo-Aryan language, which is, I guess, extremely unlikely given the genetic evidence that has come through. It's very unlikely that you had Indo-European languages being spoken in the mature Harappan period. That's what the genetic evidence seems to suggest, right? And alternatively, it could be an unknown language, a language X, so to speak, a Neolithic language which no longer survives, right? It probably survives only in the form of loan words in both modern Indo-Aryan and modern Dravidian languages. But unfortunately, I guess we'll never know the answer to this, given the fact that we don't have a bilingual text to aid decipherment of the Indus script. Right? First of all, the seals themselves are pretty short. And secondly, we don't have a bilingual text, like, for instance, the Rosetta Stone, which enabled us to decipher hieroglyphics, or the Histon inscription, right, which enabled us to decipher cuneiform in Mesopotamia, right? We don't have an equivalent of that in the Indus Valley. So I'm not sure if we'll ever figure what was the language of the Indus Valley people. Could there have been multiple languages spoken? Maybe, but then there have been studies by people like, say, G.R. Hunter was one of the early excavators who suggested that the frequency of signs in different IVC sites, they are somewhat similar to each other. So he has studied the seals in Mohenjo Daro and Harappa, which are several hundreds of kilometers away from each other. And his conclusion is that the frequency of signs are very similar, and hence he's suggesting that it's likely the same language. Right? And this is kind of backed by even Airavatam Mahadevan, who is one of the leading epigraphists of the Indus Valley remains. Right. So I'm not sure if we'll ever know the answer to that.
Gaurav?
Yeah, so Shrikant, about that language thing, the if the script is indeed representing a written language, it might be a single language, but that does not mean that the geographical regions spoke that language. That could just be the elite language or the language of communication, language of trade, which was learned by everyone. And yet,
That's a
they
good point.
happened with Sanskrit in India. So Sanskrit was a language which was spoken across the subcontinent. Yet
Or
everyone
present day
maintained their
English.
own language. Yeah,
Or present day English,
exactly.
right?
Yeah. So that is one point. And about the IVC, one of the things which is not given a lot of thought is that even the IVC per se, the integration phase, that seems to have been triggered by a climate event. So there is more robust analysis of Sumeria and first cities which were built in the land of Sumer. The theory seems to be that whenever climate started fluctuating, people uh, collaborated and built dams, ditches, canals, so on and so forth. So that is also an argument which can be made for the phase of integration, because as alluded to by earlier speakers, there were various phases of Indus Valley civilization which predated the complex IVC, mature Harappan as we say. So there was a Kot Diji phase, Ravi Harappa phase, and they had some of the things which later went on to define the IVC. But the need for integration, need for centralization per to say, or uh, that could have been also driven by a climate event which is alluded to happening around 3000 BCE. There was some fluctuation, and even the paleo archaeology for Saraswati seems to suggest that Saraswati river or the Ghagarakra channel, that also seems to have reduced before 2000 BCE itself. So it was not a glacial, a giant river when the mature Harappan civilization was there as well. So it was potentially larger a few years earlier. So that is also an angle which many have not looked into as much. I would like to add. And
Yeah,
about
yeah,
what Mukunda said about the paper which I had shared yesterday. So there was a recent article 1 year ago about it is titled "Killing the Priest King." So that proposed a heterarchy of sorts to explain the lack of hierarchy in Indus Valley civilization. So that is an interesting read. So what it implies is that kinship-based groups or occupation-based groups formed a hierarchy which went through the society, and there was competition or some city-state model similar to what we know in ancient Sumeria, which needed some integration because of the climatic stress or something
mm,
like that. But one of the fanciful models I have is that maybe something like a jati system also could have existed back then, which could explain a lot of things if we
yeah.
want to speculate.
The point you make about Saraswati River, right? We're not quite sure when it dried up completely. Maybe it was in the first half of the second millennium BCE.
Yeah,
But we do have a sanctified memory of Saraswati drying in very early Vedic texts, right? There are even rituals in texts like Panchavimsha Brahmana and also Aitareya Brahmana. I think the blogger Manasa Tarangini has written on this. Rituals that kind of sanctify the memory of a drying Saraswati. Right? So it's possible that if we take the textual evidence seriously, then it's possible that perhaps the Indo-Aryans had started inhabiting the region, the banks of the Saraswati River during its last phase, at around the time that it was drying, right? This would be a somewhat unpopular hypothesis in academic circles, in part because the Vedic literature is usually given much later dates, the second half of the first millennium, the second half of the second millennium BCE, as opposed to the first half. And we may have to push back the dates of the early Vedic texts by maybe a few hundred years for us to have the scenario where the Vedic people are already inhabiting some of these late Harappan sites, right? Uh, yeah, but that's an open question for now. Yeah.
So I have a hypothesis for that though. So why would it not be possible that the early Indo-Aryans, especially their ritual class, assimilate the Indus Valley Civilization ritual class? And I say this because, I've talked about how the Santashta Y chromosomes are found among Indian Brahmins, but it's only probably a little less than it's probably less than half actually are R1A. Some of these Y chromosomal lineages, like J2, so most years are R1A or J2, and there are some that are L. J2 and L are found in the Indus Valley Civilization. They're clearly indigenous to the zone between the Zagros and the Indus Valley area.
Mm.
So these are indigenous paternal lineages that date literally to the Indus Valley Civilization. So how do these men become Brahmins, right? So you have these like steppe pastoralists who, to be entirely frank, are barbarians. When they show up in Europe, Europe actually goes through a major regression in village life 5,000 years ago. There's archaeologists have a really difficult time finding anything from these people because they just lived out of their carts. So so these people show up in the Indus Valley Civilization area, which is a fallen society in terms of due to climate shocks, but it's still
Mm.
village based. It's still sedentary. They have to figure stuff out from the local populations, probably the local elites. There was probably some fusion, and
Mm.
and I've talked I think one of the contributors to Brown Pundits is a Kashmiri Pandit, and like I haven't obviously I haven't studied the Vedas or anything like that, but I proposed the idea that there was assimilation because like I can see it in the genetics, like these are Indus Valley Civilization paternal lineages, right? And he said that like if you look at the early Vedic texts, like there's stuff like retroflex and all this other stuff that's not found anywhere else, right? Like where did this come from? Well, I mean, if there was like a
Yeah.
ritual class that was bringing its own customs, its own traditions into, the culture of what became the Brahmins. That would make sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of something that the epigraphist Airavata Mahadevan once said. So he characterized IVC as linguistically likely Dravidian or non-Indo-European, but culturally Vedic. So many of the themes which we associate with later Vedic culture, they were perhaps found in the IVC, and they were kind of adopted by the newcomers in the region, right? So, so many things that we associate with early Indo-Aryan culture in the subcontinent perhaps have their roots in the IVC, though in a linguistic sense, perhaps at least the mature phase of Harappan civilization, they were not necessarily speaking an Indo-European tongue, but some of the cultural motifs probably were carried on in the early to middle Vedic period. Yeah.
Fascinating. So what we are saying is, here's this civilization that ranges geographically spread from what is present day central Afghanistan, the Oxus River, to all the way to Maharashtra. Possibly there are multiple languages spoken here, but there is one common language that is spoken across this area. There are then this civilization possibly meets with a catastrophic climatic change, and sort of starts decaying. And while this is happening, there are people who come in from the steppes, and they not only assimilate themselves, end up dominating, but sort of still carry forward a lot of, possibly some of the cultural practices of this area. Would that be a fair submission?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I'd probably like to get Razib's views here as well on in terms of the decline of IVC, right? I know it's the most popular explanation is to attribute it to climactic event, or maybe the drying up of rivers. But do you think we can completely rule out an invasion scenario, right, where uh, an invasion from Central Asia, right? A militarized people entered the region, and they actually caused the decline of a sudden decline of several Indus cities, right? I know this was probably a more popular hypothesis in mid 20th century, but these days it's perhaps partly politically incorrect and also unfashionable for many other reasons to talk of an invasion scenario. But what do you think of that scenario? Should we completely ditch that scenario, or what are your thoughts?
No, I mean, again, like the proof would be in archaeological remains, but like there's only so many ancient, and again, like I said, it seems to be difficult to get remains out of the subcontinent. I mean, so the Santashta people were like highly militarized. One reason we have a lot of samples from them is there are mass graves of mass killings. I don't think that they would magically become peaceful once they came to the subcontinent. Also, it's a male mediated migration. These are men showing up. How are they getting wives? Like how do steppe pastoralists get wives everywhere else they go? What they do is they kill the local men, and assimilate some of the local elites. But traditionally, they take women from the local people. In Northern Europe, this seems to have happened. You have like a lot of ancient burials where you see all of the men are of the same paternal lineage, like you can see their Y chromosome. You could use isotope analysis to figure out that they were raised in the area, and all the women were raised in different places, all have different maternal lineages. They tend to have more farmer ancestry. You can even see that. And so what you're seeing here is a fusion of two different societies. And the way it's happening is these men are coming into the area, and they're taking women, and they're taking positions of power, and they're imposing their language on these local societies. And so I think invasion, we think of it like, oh, okay, like the great king, raises his levies and all this stuff. That's not what it happens. That's not how it happens with steppe pastoralists, especially before the Turkic empires of 500 AD, which became more organized and learned from the settled peoples. Like usually it's kind of like a helter-skelter mob where basically every man on the Eurasian steppe is a potential soldier. Like the skills that they develop growing up are the skills of of a mountain warrior in terms of hunting, riding, and also like brigandage. Like they routinely engage in raiding with each other, and so they're all like mobilizable. It's not like the Roman Empire where 5% of adult males would spend their time in the legions at some point. Like every single male on the steppe, except for the shamans, would be mobilizable. And what seems to have happened where we have historical records is they invade and they take over wherever they can. So that's the key. Can they? So when the Roman Empire or the Chinese or the Iranians, the Persians, when they were able to keep the steppe people out, of course they would. And they were able to do it when they were unified, when they were strong, when they had allies on the steppe as well. So, for example, the Byzantines allied with the Khazars, et cetera, et cetera. But whenever these societies became weak and divided, the steppe populations just swarmed in whenever they could, because they want to steal stuff from these vast peasant societies. Like, wouldn't you rather live off rents than herd sheep and cattle on the open steppe? So I think that there had to be some violence, some force involved in here. I've read some of the Mahabharata and these other ancient texts. They don't seem like pacifists. They don't seem like Baniyas. They seem like Kshatriyas, right? And they take. That's just how it is.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few thoughts on this. Like one of the things that sits with me is, I know the idea is the Indo-Aryans that came in, were a horse and chariot people, and this is probably something that took centuries to have the move from Central Asia or the steppe into the Indian subcontinent, right? And then when you start hitting, like places like the Khyber Pass and Hindu Kush and these mountainous regions, it seems very, very implausible for me to think about how they would have maintained a chariot-based culture through centuries of migration this way, right? You'd build I would imagine a settlement somewhere for a short period of time, and then you'd move on and then continue that process. And in this time period, like I'm not sure the technological means, and my guess also is, as a society, the Sanishta or the Indo-Aryans at this point did not have any sort of of written records, right? So I find this to be an issue that people seem to gloss over, and I'm not sure how. Maybe there's something out there to give us indication that the way the migration occurred, right? Instead of just saying a migration occurred, we have to also have an explanation of how it did occur. So that's one perspective. The other perspective I would also say is, so as Razib pointed out earlier, the material culture, or what we have, the remnants of the material culture from the decline period, seems to be pretty absent of any sort of violent incursion. Now, that's not to say it couldn't have occurred. It could have, and we should still keep that the idea in the back of our mind that this is one possible way that this happened. But I tend to maybe have a little more diverse opinion. Maybe some of this was, if they came in, some of this was through violence. Some of it, I would imagine, over time, as they integrated with other communities, whether it's from the periphery of the IVC culture and they integrated into those communities, they probably had more of a merchant kind of change. I don't know. Again, these are all speculations that I don't think are either buttressed by the evidence or opposed by the evidence. And so I do think that any such migration that would have happened, it probably is much more complicated and complex than we are giving current explanations about. And I do think, like, if we think about the nature of the IVC and how, first of all, how uniform it was across, we can hear you, Shrikantha. How uniform it was across the entire the entire civilization, they probably very clearly had communication techniques between each city and each settlement that allowed it to be so like networked and sinuous together. So I do think that we have to maybe take a step back when we discuss this and have a little more deep dive as to how, why, what methodologies, what evidence do we have, and I'm not sure right now that we have any more information about how it would have occurred than we did maybe 50 or 100 years ago.
Sure, fair
Yeah,
enough.
so just one thing to add about chariot point which Mukunda made. So again, those are open questions. I am not very well versed in it, so I cannot answer. But what we know is that right after we find the archaeological chariots in Shintashta, chariots are found from Egypt to Shang, China. So they somehow like they went a lot, they traveled a lot of distance. So I'm not quite like, I don't find the mountains of Hindu Kush or Pamirs being that much of a problem for technology transfer, because if we can
Yeah. Well,
we
so
know the
yeah.
Mitanni. Yeah, go on, Razib.
Well, let me just point out. So the chariots, there were chariots around before the Santashta. The Santashta innovation was the light chariot, the light war chariot, and you know, these are obviously they're taken apart and reassembled. That's clearly what has to happen, because there's no way that they're going to. I mean, they're not gonna like travel thousands of miles in a chariot, right? Like, so obviously they're mostly in carts. The chariots are taken apart and they're reassembled, and that's how they get to China and Egypt so early. Probably there were chariot specialists, like drivers, artisans, these sorts of people that probably went to Egypt. And the ones that are in Shang, China, like we know that they're Shintashta because there's like non-functional aspects of these early chariots that are just totally replica copies of the early Shintashta chariots. So the people who made them or who taught them how to make them, they were the people genealogically from the Shintashta. And another thing I will say is we now know all domestic horses in the world derive from the Shintashta horses. Like, we have ancient DNA now. It's been confirmed over the last couple of months. So all of the horses in the world are from the horses of that Kazakh steppe. They're not the European horses that were present earlier. They're horses in China. There's all sorts of domestication events that were happening then, but it turns out all the horses are from the Santashta horses. So I think that's really interesting. Also, in terms of time scale, I don't necessarily actually think it would take centuries. I don't think it was a gradual movement. I think the issue here is if it's a movement of males, so basically a gradual movement would be a folk wandering. So the Visigoths, for example, had a folk wandering, and they went stepwise, and they brought their women and children in the carts. This obviously happens sometimes with the Indo-Europeans, but I think the Santashta movement in particular, I think we got to be careful here because they're moving without women, and so it's like I think they're moving fast. I think these are young, they're young Marianu, they're young war bands of males, and they initially are raiding, but it turns out that they don't need to just raid; they can just take over and settle in. And I think a good model here would be what the Ghaznavids on the Turco-Mongols, the Mughals did later. Their initial goal was to raid and plunder, and then they were just like, well, we could just stay, And so obviously this was like on a different scale in a primitive society, but I think it probably did happen fast. Yeah, and like there's not that much. One of the weird things in the early genetic data, there's not that much evidence of admixture with the Bactria margiana culture. We have a lot of ancient DNA from them, or with populations in Iran. So it looks like they traversed through very fast. It looks like they saw an opportunity and they took it.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
how I like to think of this is maybe like guilds of mercenaries or something like that, because we know the Indo-Aryans or Proto-Indo-Aryans were in Mitanni and they formed the ruling elite. And so we do not have a genetic impact from the Sintashta people in that region, right, Razib?
Yeah, no,
Even
I've
the,
asked. I've
yeah,
asked. Like, there's no R1A Z. Well, there's very little R1A Z93 in Syria today. I've asked geneticists that have
right,
worked in that area.
right. So one of the things which I look at is comparing like Mitanni to Indo-Aryans in the Vedic people. So if they could form a ruling elite without leaving a genetic legacy, without leaving a linguistic legacy, so in this case we have a massive genetic legacy. So I don't think that could have happened like without subsequent cultural changes.
Sure. I mean, I'm not discounting that. I would. My point on this would be a little more akin to, like, so if the migration happened, say the 1800 whatever one around that time period, and it happened quickly, I think the concern ends up happening is, number one, you're traversing vast amounts of land in, it would say even 100 years or whatever, it's a short time period, and what you're having basically is an entire population of hundreds, maybe thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being overrun by, I would imagine, a few thousand, right? And maybe that's entirely possible, and possible. It would seem to me that there's a lot more that has to be going on than just simply a group of Sintashta people coming through, with already a culture that existed with fortified walls. I'm not sure how you have chariots that could beat the walls, but again, maybe some military historian can better correct me on this. But I do think there are hurdles there that we also have to grapple with. And I do understand that what we're saying is they went from China to Syria, but much of that land is pretty traversable by foot and horses and chariots between these regions, right? It's not a super mountainous region. It's not a very difficult journey in the way that coming into the subcontinent is. And on top of it, like, we have to also consider the IVC at this time was still, it was declining, sure, but it was still a massive civilization with probably deep communication lines that, something, would have popped up in material culture of anywhere from Afghanistan, or Oxus, all the way down to central India, will have some evidence of some sort of warfare of sorts.
Or possibly they followed the East India Company model. So war where it was necessary, trade where it worked trade, diplomacy where it worked diplomacy. I was saying possibly it was a combination of what the East India Company did. They fought where it was necessary, or they just did trade, or they just assimilated themselves and captured power with the local elite. Obviously, there's a lot more that we can find out, and hopefully, we'll find out over a period of time.
So about the East India Company comparison, Manish. So I don't think that is a like reasonable model. Firstly, because these were very tribal societies, very different societies than the centralized and uh, developed, so as to speak, British Empire, British East India Company. So that is one part. I think, yeah, but I think we don't need to go deep into that. So one of the things which is about the IVC collapses, this was a theory which is there actually in scholarship as well. But I particularly thought about it during the 2020 COVID lockdowns, that if some systems are super efficient and they are well oiled with lot of integration, lot of trade, and a lot of give and take, which seems to be the model for the IVC integration, it's it's easier for them to collapse when one brick sort of crumbles. So that may have been one of the contributing factors for the collapse. And I think we can
Hmm.
fairly rule out the Aryan invasion for collapse, because archaeologically we can see from Mohenjo Daro or from Rakhigarhi, from all the sides actually, especially in the north. So I was saying, yeah, the northern sites, the sites of Rakhigarhi, Mohenjo Daro, and those sites, they had started shrinking or sort of collapsing even before the 1900 BCE period. So the earliest date for the Aryan
Hmm.
invasion doesn't match with like the whatever we know from the IVC data. IVC continued as a civilization only till 2000 BC, and the next period is called as disintegration or again localization phase, where the trade networks which Mukunda alluded to were already broken. That is one of the reasons why they began localizing, the standardizing weights and all the systems which made IVC quote unquote civilization, they were not in existence in the disintegration or the post Harappan phase, so to speak.
Yeah. So, but I think one thing we need to keep in mind is that the ancient DNA studies have just barely
Right.
started, right? It's only for the past few years that we've been looking at these samples from that period. So as evidence accumulates, you never know the onset of the step people. It could be pushed back even further, right? So that allows for a bigger overlap between the advent of the step people and the mature Harappan phase, right? We are completely ruling that out today because so far we have not seen any kind of overlap with respect to the ancient DNA, right? But I think the Rakigadi sample, which Vagish Narasimhan and others studied, that is, I think, closer to 2500
I think
BCE,
there
right?
is some
If I'm not wrong. So,
like the dates are not accurate. I think it is 2300 BC to 2500 BC. So
right, 2300 to 2500. So that still allows us for the period after 2300 BCE up till 1900 BCE, right? Could we have had migrations during that period? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, but it's still an open question. We need to have an open
yeah,
mind there.
that is
Yeah.
actually an interesting model, especially from what we know about the Mitanni state. So those were like full-fledging states in Mitanni, Hurrian, or Kassites, and that is when the like what we call the Indo-Aryans who happened to rule the Mitanni state, when they integrated or sort of imposed themselves on the people over there. So that happened when they were already like there were empires there. So
Hmm.
in spite of that, they could do that over there.
So
Right.
in the present day geographical maps, where are these Mitanni
Syria,
states? Which countries in Central
in
Asia?
Syria,
Syria.
yeah. So that is where actually the first attested Indo-Aryan Indo-Aryan language is found. It is inscribed.
Right, but that is closer to 1400, 1500 BCE, right? That's
Yes,
much
yes,
later,
yes.
if I'm
Yeah, yeah.
not wrong,
The
right?
model I was talking about the model
And
specifically. So that could be a model
right,
for IVC as well, because we know the the steppe people were there around the Bactria margiana complex. So they were on the peripheries
mm,
of them. So they like if we
mm,
assume that the Sintasta people were mercenaries and people who specialized in war, they would have been in demand in these civilizations, either as a protecting force or like we can think of n number of
right.
reasons why we would want such elites who had horses, sophisticated
Yeah,
weapons.
that's definitely an interesting model. Yeah, I agree with you. But the reason it is not entertained is in part because so far, I guess the ancient DNA has been pretty scarce, and it is suggesting a much later onset of the steppe people. And also, several Indologists, they are kind of inclined to give a very late date to Indo-Aryan literature, at least the early portions of Rigveda. I mean, Witzel and others, they place it in the second half of the second millennium
Yes.
BCE. And that's in part because of the Mitanni superstrates that you
Hmm.
mentioned, right? It seems to be in an archaic Indo-Aryan form, and they are placing Rigveda after that. But if we were to consider an earlier origin for Vedic literature, right? That makes things a little more interesting. So if you're talking about the composition of Vedic texts around 2000 BCE, right, or maybe even earlier, right, that makes for a more interesting model where you could have had a bigger overlap between Vedic culture and the mature Harappan period, right? But I understand that that's not a popular hypothesis at this
Yeah.
moment
So another reason I think
in
Shrikant for
academia.
that is we for the Indo-European incursions into Europe, we have a lot of material evidence for destruction, invasion, so to speak, especially with corded ware, the battle axe sculptures, or even the bell pickers. So a lot of sites with mass graves, so on and so forth. But in India, we like because we have done precious little archaeology, we do not have any such sites. So that is also one reason why invasions are ruled out. and that also maybe has something to do with the politics of early 20th century and how the Nazis used their Uruhemite hypothesis for that supremacy model. So actually, the archaeologists after that they stopped thinking of migrations and invasions as a way of material transfer. So pots, not people,
Right.
was the preferred approach till we got into ancient DNA and we started seeing that no, like especially in Europe, there is almost 70 to 80% population replacement in the early Bronze Age. So that has again changed some of the priors.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think Razib made that point that more than 90% of modern Indians, be it in North or South, have some steppe ancestry, right? It may be small, but it is still there. It suggests that the population inflow was pretty significant. It was not just a very small minority that migrated as was originally thought
Yeah,
of, right? It was sizable in number. Yeah.
And the fact that, I mean, he mentioned that some castes, people like Reddy's in Andhra, also show an IVC connection signal, possibly. And like you were saying, Shrikant, if tomorrow we are able to date the Vedic literature to 2000 BC or even before that, then maybe it will give strength to the other view, which is that there was a thriving civilization and that which had assimilated parts from Central Asia or as far as Syria. And this whole idea that of this AIT, which is the Aryan invasion theory, is sort of the hand is overplayed, isn't it?
not necessarily. What
Yeah.
Shrikant is saying is to the
Yeah.
earlier like migration invasion, so to speak. So an migration which contributed to the integration of IVC, so to speak.
Mhm. That's right. I mean, there are a lot of open questions here, right? And also with respect to dating the early portions of Vedic literature, that's a very big open question, right? So at the moment, in academia, the tendency is to date even Rig Veda post 1500 BCE, but that is not internally kind of consistent with the some astronomical markers that exist within Vedic literature, both in Rig Veda and Yajur Veda, right? Which suggests that the composition of the early layers of this literature was likely pre 2000 BCE. And if we were to take those astronomical markers seriously, then it also raises this possibility of the early Samhita literature being composed outside of the Indian subcontinent, right? Maybe even before the Indo PIA PIIR split, right? Even before Indo-Aryan split from Indo-Iranian, and a possible recomposition of Vedic literature in the new dialect after the tribes settled in India. And this is a minority view. I think Manasak Tarangini, the blogger, is he pushes for this view, if I'm not wrong. Right? And there's an interesting view. At least we should definitely entertain it, even though it may not be a mainstream view at this moment. Right? A possible recomposition of Vedic literature at a much later date in a new dialect, though the core of that Vedic literature might uh, be actually placed in a geography which is not a part of the current Indian subcontinent. Right? That's a minority view.
Yeah.
Sure. So now coming back to the other aspects of IVC, do we have any sense of what was the main occupation of the inhabitants? What was the bedrock of their economy? What do we know about that?
I mean, yeah. I think the genetic evidence is now making it somewhat clear. And Gaurav, you can correct me if I'm wrong. That farming, for the most part, appears to have developed indigenously within the Indian
Yeah.
subcontinent, right? Because if you look at this Rakigadi sample, it represents a population which broke off from the other populations we know of in the early Neolithic period, or maybe in the Paleolithic
In the
period, more than
Pleistocene, in the
10,000
late
years ago.
Pleistocene.
Yeah, late Pleistocene. So what that suggests is that farming appears to have had an independent indigenous origin within the subcontinent, and like any other um, uh, agricultural society, I mean, farming was I guess, the bedrock of the Indus people. But one thing I would like to point out here is that it seems like there was some amount of diversification, remarkable diversification in the economy. I mean, even in the pre-urban phase, right? Because we tend to associate diversification of occupations, etc., with urbanism. But even if you look at the archaeological remains from Mehergarh, right, which is a very, very early Indus Valley, it's not exactly Indus Valley, it's closer to Baluchistan. The Mehergarh remains suggest the cultivation of cotton, right, and also the possible use of cotton for textiles as early as 6000 BCE, right, or maybe even earlier than that, right? So Mehergarh is by no means an urban civilization. It's at best a farming village, a large village, right? And it's separated from, say, Mohenjo Daro and Harappa, both in time and space, right? By almost a couple of thousand years. And yet we have these uh, occupations like, say, cultivation of cotton and the use of cotton for textiles, etc., as well as indications of trade with Oman and also Iran, right? Uh, in Mehergarh itself. So, if even in the pre-urban phase, as early as 6000 BCE, we see trade, and we also see cultivation of cotton. It's probably the earliest cultivation of cotton anywhere in the world, right? What we have seen in the Mehergarh remains. So that's something worth noting, I would say. I mean,
So we are saying it's not just agriculture for food crops, but we are also saying possibly there were cash crops, and then there were trade linkages.
Yeah. So
exactly. And what's most remarkable is these trade linkages and the cultivation of these non-food crops, so to speak. It even predates urbanism. We're not even talking about Kot DG or mature Harappa here. We're talking about Mehergarh, which is a very early
600 BC.
stage of the Indus civilization. Yeah, yeah.
So we have people who one could say their bedrock was agriculture. Do we know anything about what kind of was there any kind of primitive industrial activity or what kind of services they traded, and do we have any evidence of what kind of medicinal practices they had or
I think before that, Manish, I
anything
would
from
like to add something on the agriculture part. So one of the things is,
Sure.
yeah, so one of the things is the IVC from a population genetic perspective is a mixture of two populations. One which we call Iranian agriculturalist or farmers, and second which we call the AASI or the native Indians, so to speak. So that is one aspect, and the agriculture, as alluded to by Razib as well, the agriculture seems to have started when these around the time when these two started mixing. So with respect to agriculture, it may be possible that that started independently, but one of the arguments against that is the uh, toolkit of agriculture in IVC. It is very similar to the toolkit uh, in the West, in Middle East or so on. The Zebu cattle, which was
Hmm.
domesticated in IVC, is indigenous, but the wheat, barley, uh, goats, that toolkit is exactly similar to the one in the West. So that is one of the reasons. I mean, it may be inspired, or as well as some of the cultivations, as cotton and some legumes potentially could have been domesticated in IVC, but some crops could have been like transferred from the west. That is one model. And also, if you go to the east, in what is today Uttar Pradesh or at the foothills of Himalaya, there are many sites which are not very well documented, but there is some evidence of cultivation or at least capture of wild rice of an earlier variety at Lahura Deva or some sites in the east. So that is also one thing which is not explored to that extent. And one of the things which I would also like to point here is that Razib talked about these two genetic components, right? The farmers and AASI. So most people tend to assume that the AASI, so to speak, were hunter-gatherers. But I don't think we can call them hunter gatherers. Like we don't know anything about them. So calling them hunter gatherers just because, like, I am of the opinion, based on like these sites like Lahura Deva for one, that they may have been there may have been some cultivation among these people as well. And
Mhm.
even when we get into the historical period, like when Ashoka talks about the forest tribes, they are pretty complex. and they don't seem to be like simple hunter gatherers who Ashoka could just go in and invade and rule. So he had some troubles with them. So assuming that the
Hmm.
ASI were hunter gatherers is not accurate, I think. So
Yeah, I would probably like to make one point there. Uh, I understand that the IVC client itself includes IAA, part of it is AASI, right? But that's from what remember. It's a
yes,
fairly
around
small part. I
25%.
think IVC client can be. From what I recall, I think for the Rakigadi sample, it's more like 85% Iranian hunter-gatherer, Iranian farmer, and 15% ASI. I may be wrong here. So, so how much do we attribute the cultural memes and the predilections of the Indus Valley people to that ASI component? I'm not very sure, right? I mean, but we need to take that as a pinch of salt, given that ASI is by no means the dominant component of the IVC
No, no,
client,
I
right?
was not talking particularly about IVC, but we know that there were a lot of people to the east of IVC. So outside IVC, there were
Hmm.
a lot of people. So I wouldn't call that, like, assume that they were hunter gatherers, because what we know
Yeah,
from
fair enough.
like Europe is typically when farmers and hunter gatherers mix, hunter gatherers are like sort of uh, unless like there are some exceptions like Jomon Japan or some others, Razib would maybe point out that uh, the demographic impact of hunter gatherers by and large is very small, around like 5%,
Right.
10% or less than that. In case of India, the AASI are definitely around 30%, which is substantial. And to have two populations mixing, one hunter gatherers which are typically have low population densities and farmers who have high
Hmm.
population densities, you would not get those kind of mixtures. Even you wouldn't get 75 25, which is the IVC.
Sure. I think sure. I think we'll sort of come back to what we were talking about IVC at that stage. I'll come to what was happening in rest of the subcontinent while IVC was flourishing in a bit. So what we are saying is not only was agriculture there, agriculture was slightly evolved. There were also trade linkages. So that's what we know about the agricultural practices in IVC.
Right.
What else do we know about that society, Shrikant and Gaurav? What was? Do we know anything about their art and literature? Performing arts,
I mean,
any kind of art?
yeah, we do know a lot about their artistic production from the material remains, right? But one thing to bear in mind is that the artistic production of the Harappans was very small in scale. I mean, we don't see huge pyramids or huge structures of the kind that you see in Egypt or Mesopotamia, right? We are talking about art production on a much smaller scale. You could say that the Bronze Age was probably inaugurated in IVC, in mature Harappan phase, right? The first bronze statue from anywhere in the world is from Mohenjo Daro. I think it's dated to around 2500 BC. The famous dancing girl,
Yeah.
that is a bronze statue, and that's probably the earliest bronze statue from anywhere in the world, if I'm not wrong, right?
Right, right.
There's also evidence of basketry, pottery in Mehergarh itself, with geometric designs on them. And this is long before urbanism, right? This is as early as 5000, 6000 BCE. You have evidence of textiles, evidence of basketry, pottery in Mehergarh, right? There's also extensive trade linkages, which I already mentioned, right? There was a turquoise trade with Iran, shell trade with Oman,
Lapis lazuli.
lapis lazuli
Yeah.
trade with Central Asia,
I think even
right?
ivory was
Uh,
traded
uh, uh,
extensively.
right, exactly, yeah. So extensive trade linkages going all the way back to the pre-urban phase itself, right? And of course, we already mentioned cotton cultivation. It's probably the first place in the world to grow cotton, right? Because evidence of cotton in Mesopotamia comes much, much later, I think in the first millennium BCE. And evidence of cotton in China also comes from the first millennium BCE, right? At a much later date. We are talking about, so I think the Indus Valley region cultivated cotton a few millennia before any other place in the world, if I'm not wrong, right? So that's something worth noting. And also there were major advancements in material science during the mature to late Harappan period, right? So you have the famous priest king sculpture from Mohenjo Daro, right, which I think everyone would have seen. That dates to around 2000 BCE, right? And that is made of steatite, if I'm not wrong. And to make that sculpture, experts suggest that it was probably heated up to 1000 degrees to harden the material, right? So there were advancements in annealing and heat treatment to harden materials, right? So these techniques were kind of known, at least in the mature to late Harappan phase, right? And even the seals, the Indus seals were made of steatite, if I'm not wrong, and these were made durable. The reason they've lasted this long is because they were subjected to extreme heat, right? Annealing procedures. So these are certain things which we can definitely glean from the material
Yeah.
evidence.
No, it's fascinating considering here is a civilization that has agriculture, that has trade, that has metallurgy, and that has now technology to sort of heat stuff till 1000 degrees. And they've not left a script that we can interpret. What are we missing there?
I think we are predisposed to
Yeah. So,
look at
yeah, go ahead.
literature or like literate civilizations as the norm. So that is one reason, I think.
Right. And if you think about it, the aversion towards writing, right, where we tend to that has always been a characteristic of Indian civilizations, and not just IVC, but even in later times,
Yes.
right? So during the Vedic period, you had enormous bodies of literature being composed, right? You have the Samhitas, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads. You had great grammarians like Panini, right? And yet they did not leave behind inscriptions. They did not leave behind writing, right? So it seems like huge amounts of literature were composed during the Vedic period without a script, without writing. It was just pure oral composition and memorization and transmission from father to son in many cases, right? And this seems to have been a characteristic even of IVC. If you think about it, even like the later Vedic culture, even the Indus Valley people do not appear to have been fond of writing, right? So they had a script, but definitely that script was not used for writing large documents or writing big proclamations, right? It appears to have been used by traders and merchants, maybe for writing contracts, right? So there appears to have been a very limited use of the script, and in this respect we are kind of very distinct from other civilizations globally, right? Be it China or Mesopotamia or Egypt, right? And those civilizations have a much greater affinity to writing, unlike IVC or even the later Vedic culture, right? Something to
I
bear
think
in
there is a
mind.
caveat over
And this,
here that there could have been written material on biodegradable, like degradable material, which we do not have anymore. So, like for even the Vedic scriptures were initially written on some manuscripts which were not like preserved, right? So
hmm,
that could be one
yeah,
reason.
that's a possibility.
So they didn't write on material that was lasted, like long lasting, like unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt on clay tablets or
True,
something. But they could have still
true.
been
Yeah,
literate. So we can't say anything.
it could have been. Yeah. Having said that, I mean, as moderns, we tend to associate writing with
Yes,
civilization, right? We tend to use the term illiterate in
pejorative.
a
Yeah.
pejorative way, right? We look down upon people who are illiterate, right? But you don't need writing to be civilized or to run a complex society, right? And that's what we are gathering from both IVC and even the later Vedic culture, right? So you could have fairly complex philosophies being devised, fairly complex cogitations on many subjects without writing, right?
But my,
So
my counter to that would be, Shrikant, what about the mundane stuff? How does a civilization or a society with such extensive international linkages, and if it has to run, not have a medium of communication that is not only universally acceptable but is universally practiced? Writing is just one of them. There has to be some way a society like this is managed, accounts kept, ledgers kept, uh, calculations for structures done.
Yeah, and that's why you do see the use of a script, right? It's not that there was no writing. We do have the Indus script, and many samples of that script have been found in other geographies as well, right? In the Middle East and in Oman, they have we have enough samples of Indus script gathered from Oman and from other parts of the Middle East, if I'm not wrong, right? So definitely the script was used for trading purposes, and I know some people have pushed the view that it's like maybe not even a script, right? It was not used to write any language. I think that was the view pushed by Michael Witzel at one point, but that is not necessarily a very popular view even in academia, right? It was very likely a script, and it was definitely used for the purposes you mentioned, right? But it was definitely not used for political purposes or for compositions of major texts or major inscriptions.
Yeah.
And that's in part got to do with the political structure of IVC as well. It does not seem to have been a strong monarchy with a centralized state and a single monarch, right? These appear to have been city states, right? Each independent from the other, likely with linkages in terms of ideology and religion, and maybe even trade linkages, right? But it is unlikely to have been an empire ruled by a single monarch, right? If that were the case, maybe you would have seen the use of the same IVC script for political purposes, like
Yeah.
declarations and proclamations, etc. And you don't see that. That's in part got to do with the political structure.
Yeah.
Right. So, which brings me to the next point. Right. So, how was the IBC structured? What do we know about how the society was politically structured? Were they nation states? Were they city states? Was it, what kind of society did we
Yeah,
have?
nothing. This is honestly like everything about like whether there were even kings or empires or how they function fundamentally. We have no clue. We know. I mean, again, like I said earlier, what we know is materially they seem well each quote unquote city state within the larger IVC group was unique in terms of what they produced. And the trade that was enacted in that location. What we also know is that they were very uniform in many ways in terms of their buildings, their style of buildings, their material culture was very uniform. So we have disparate lines of information here, right? So in one sense, it appears as if it's part of one empire, so to speak, like something centrally administered, and kind of like regulated in some sense. But there seems to be no indication that there was a ruling elite. There seems to be no indication that there was any sort of necessarily hierarchy. We just don't know, and this really comes down to is like we don't have any cultural literary evidence, and the material evidence we have is very uniform. So it's very tough to make a lot of conclusions about IVC culture and the people and the community and whatever. I mean, again, like I said, each city state had its own unique agriculture and unique trades that were found. Like, for example, like I think Shrikant mentioned certain areas had lapis lazuli, other places did cotton, other places did barley, wheat, and so there was very locally tailored in some sense. But also we find, like in whether we look at super ancient Rome, or like Sumeria or Acadia, and we find even in what we now know as the Fertile Crescent in Egypt, we find products from IVC from what appears to be different parts of IVC, right? Like whether it's Dolavira or Harappa or Mohenjo Daro or a bunch of different places, we find that there had to be some way for it to get there. Maybe they used the Lothal as a port in which they went up into the Levant area and traded that way, or do they use land routes? I mean, these are very interesting questions that I don't know how much information we have. We know trade occurred, and we know it occurred very strongly in favor of IVC people, the the society, because it appears to be rather rich in terms of the fact that it provided housing for, it looks like, pretty much everyone uniformly. It had like communal baths. It had communal, like, pretty much everything, right? It was high levels of enjoyment across the board, and not restricted as many other places were.
Yeah, so one thing which we missed out is the era of integration, so to speak, the 2600 BC E period. Uh, it seems that before that there was a there is some evidence of violence. So the era of integration is speculated to have began with some sort of violence, because there is a layer of burning before, and some of the centers, like for example the Côte d'Iji and some other pre-urban centers before mature Harappan were abandoned. So there are some intelligent speculations we can make, but nothing more than that. I am in favor of a trade oligarchy, or something on lines of what we know happened in the Eastern republics during the century before, like around the time of Buddha, the republics which are attested historically. So even there is no concept of like one king. So something like an oligarchy, that could a trade oligarchy could make sense. But again, we have very limited understanding, and bathing seems to be important. So one thing which we missed out is the incidentally the photograph which we have used for the this series from Hampi, the Pushkarni, the water body. So there is some architectural scholars who think that that goes back to the Great Bath of Mohenjo Daro. So this system of Pushkarni or baths seen across India. So that some scholars believe that I read that paper a couple of days ago, that is architecturally descendant of the bath of Mohenjo Daro, so to speak.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Pushkarnis are common, pretty much a feature of just about every South Indian temple, even to this day, right? At the end of the day, we are speculating here, right? We don't quite know if the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro was indeed a great bath, or was it used for a different purpose.
Yeah,
It's speculation at the end of the day. We can never be 100% sure. With respect to the points that Mukunda made, uh, there seems to be considerable diversity even in town planning, right? So Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, these are not very similar towns, right? They are different from each other. Harappa is a multi-walled town, if I'm not wrong. So there are multiple walls. So you could think of Harappa as a collection of cities, right, with different, which are each of which has separate walls.
yeah. Shrikant,
Mohenjo-daro,
let me just add to that. Like, I just want to say, like, I don't mean that they're absolutely 100% uniform. What I do mean is that there was structured planning around it, which
yeah,
seemed to lead to that there was some central way of doing
agree.
that.
Right. Yeah. That's true. Of course, there are similarities in terms of measures, in terms of how the bricks are used. Right? There's a 4:2:1 ratio that people usually cite, right, for the length, breadth, and height of a brick, and that seems to be kind of uniform across sites. But at the level of town planning, there are differences. I mean, Harappa, as I said, is a multiple-walled city. Dholavira is organized very differently. I think it takes the form of an inner city followed by concentric circles around it, right? And that's probably because Dholavira was located on an island in Kutch at that point. I don't think it's an island anymore, but at that point it was an island, and that probably demanded a different kind of organization. Also, unlike say Sumerian cities, the city doesn't seem to revolve around a single structure, maybe a temple or a palace, right? In ancient Sumer, it seems like all of the city roads lead up to a temple or the palace, whereas in Mohenjo Daro you have a grid-like system, mains and crosses, so to speak, right? It's more, it doesn't seem as if all of the roads lead to one single place. So in that sense, town planning is markedly different from what you see in the Middle East. Yeah.
Possibly they were, I think, would a comparison with the present day European Union be a valid comparison, that you have these independent city states who do their own thing, but there is still some commonality because there is some kind of a.
I think the Sumerian model is a better fit, where we had city states like Ur, Uruk, and Eridu, all those cities with their typical gods. The only missing thing like is that there were temples, priests, and language, and so many things. But there was centralization there as well. For example, the bowl, the distinctive Sumerian bowl, that is found across the Sumerian landscape, and there were many commonalities there as well. So had like, I sometimes imagine if we let's assume that we did not have any scripts for ancient Sumer, we might have looked at it in a way similar to IVC as well. That is also
Hmm.
possible.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think the commonality across cities is evident from the script. The script doesn't vary. Seals in Harappa, seals in Mohenjo-Daro, or Rakhi Gadi, the inscriptions, the signs used are kind of uniform. So there appears to have been a single script. And there are also certain common cultural motifs, like, say, the unicorn, right, which is a common figure, a single horned animal, right, which is found
Yeah,
across sites. So there definitely seems to have been a strong ideological connections binding the entire region together. But I'd like to ask, maybe if others might know, how about the cities at the periphery of this civilization, right? We have the later cultures in Maharashtra, like the Daimabad
Daimabad.
culture, which is supposed to
Uh,
be late Harappan, and also we have the northern IVC sites, like I think is it Shortugai?
Shaturgai,
It's on the bank,
Shaturgai,
banks of
yeah,
the Oxus
Oxus.
Yeah,
Oxus
yeah.
River. That's actually pretty close to the BMAC cities, right? So
Yes.
I'm wondering if the culture in Shortugai is distinctively Harappan, or does it have affinities to BMAC, right?
Yeah,
I'm
it,
not well
it,
read
it
enough on that. Yeah.
yeah, it appears it's much more aligned with the IVC or that culture
Hmm.
than it is Mac. I mean,
Interesting.
like even Lothal, right? We think about Lothal, that is a later Harappan development, right? I believe it's like 2000, roughly 2000 to 1700 or 1600
Yeah.
BCE, around there.
Yeah.
So even that shows very much the similar grid structure, like central town planning. And all that stuff. So there's certain features of Shortugai also shows that. But Shortugai is also a much smaller settlement or city than like Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro or even like Dolavira and stuff. So
Yeah.
these periphery cities, my guess, and this is absolute 100% horseshit speculation, is that they were probably like trading places of where a lot of trade with other communities started to occur. Maybe like not a port town necessarily, but a waypoint. But again, that's just totally uneducated.
Yeah.
Hmm.
One interesting thing about BMAC is BMAC seems to have integrated after Harappa started declining. So
Hmm.
there is very little overlap between BMAC and
Interesting.
Indus Valley
Yeah.
Civilization.
It is interesting, and this I'll bring up from your last podcast. I wasn't present, but I do find this interesting when you guys are discussing things like Aryavata or Bharatvarsha or these
Brahmavarta.
terms for land masses. I find it very, very interesting that the scope in which even the Rig Vedic and the early Puranic period, right? Because first of all, I think most of the dating on these texts are bullshit. Sorry for cussing, but these texts seem to correlate. And again, this is just a correlation. It's not like or it could be coincidence. They seem to basically cover the entire region of what is what was IVC, right? From the Oxus all the way down to the almost the Gangetic Plain, this was considered Aryavarta, right? The land, or Aryavarsha or Brahmavarta. It was, at different stages called different names, but we have a sense that this land was the land of the Aryas from all that region. I'm not saying that this was because of indigenous Aryans or people coming from outside, whatever it is. There just seems to be some sort of coincidence correlation about the landmass that seems to have continuity from IVC time to Vedic time and beyond.
So I think when Mukunda you were not there, we actually touched upon that. So one of the things which Razib alluded to was a model which some of the commentators of Brown Pandits like Kaisha have stated that they see the Brahmana Varna, so to speak, or Vedic culture forming out of merger of IVC plus step that is attested in the Y chromosomes, because majority of my Y chromosomes of Brahmins in India are not step, like they are I think around 40% or so.
Yeah,
Most are
I
still
think we are now
IVC.
digressing. I think sort of to pull back everybody in, come back everybody.
Yes, yes.
Sorry to sort of button like this. What we are saying is that there's a lot of stuff about IVC that is in the realms of speculation. We clearly know this was a civilization that was around from 2600 BC to about 1800 BC. It stretched from central Afghanistan to Maharashtra in present day India. It had agriculture, it had trade links with Middle East. It had towns which were integrated, which had some commonality between them, but they were still largely independent in the way they were functioning. And we know that because of the way the towns are structured, as well as the differences that we find in the citizens who live there. Now, finally, to come back to the end of it, so we now know it's 1800 BC to 1500 BC, and the civilization sort of past its peak and it's sort of collapsing. Who are the gods the people are praying to? What was the religion like in this civilization? Do we know anything about this? How
Nope.
are people sort of accepting the fact that it's all coming to an end?
Nope.
So
We know
we,
nothing about their religion.
yeah,
Nothing about their practice. We know we have the obviously the Pashupata seal that everyone refers to, or the yogic seal. And again, like I, it's all speculation across the board.
not very
Whether
convincing.
that,
Yeah,
yeah, it's whether it's yoga stems from it, or that's actually proto Shiva, or it's. I mean, look, I mean, we just don't. We have no clue. And
yeah.
and the more we try to make theories around it, and we can speculate all we want, but the problem is our speculations, and this I find in the literature quite often, what becomes as a speculation in the beginning becomes absolute fact by the end, right? By later generations, and then becomes ossified.
So we'll not fall in the trap for the sake of this podcast. We'll say we don't know and we'll stick to that.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
just
because
give three notes actually. Maybe Shrikant can. So there is a Bhandarkar Institute scholar called R.N. Dandekar. So he had some interesting insights on which some of the work by Witzel and Ascoparpola is built on. So actually, earlier generation of scholars were quite confident that the Pashupati seal corresponds to a proto Shiva. So he has like I have his books. He has made a lot of claims, but they are no longer considered like mainstream today. Another Indologist, Asko Parpola, so he has actually written an entire book on roots of Hinduism, where half of the book is about Vedic, the Indus Valley religion. So he doesn't talk particularly about the Pashupata seal, but he talks about Durga motifs and some other motifs here and there, some crocodile motifs which are there in later Hinduism. But if readers like listeners want, they can go and speculate. But it's
yeah,
very
I
tenuous
mean,
at best.
so it's tenuous at best, and it's also we have to remember religion in many ways, like much of culture, is localized, right? So if you have a crocodile that's constantly in your world, you're going to have it expressed in your stories, in your religion, in your mythology. Like whether you want to call like a makara a gangetic dolphin or not, or something else, or a crocodile or whatever. It's really dependent upon like the local region you are, and and I think like sometimes we want to read as if like they took it from something else. When even if say assume the Aryans came in, they saw these crocodiles and they made it part of their world, right? And I'm just saying, like, we tend to want to build continuous narratives, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but it might not always be right.
Yes.
True.
So
Shrikant,
one thing is
Shrikant, your
there
thoughts
are a
on
lot.
that?
Yeah, Shrikant.
Yeah, and when we talk of religion, of course, there's been a lot of speculation around the Pashupata seal representing a proto Shiva, right? Having said that, Shiva is very much a Vedic deity, right? So Rudra has a very prominent place in Yajurveda, and to a lesser extent, even in Rig Veda, right? And the iconography for Rudra that emerges out of the early Vedic literature, it's pretty much consistent with the iconographies that we associate with Shiva today, right? It's not radically different. And there have been Indo-European scholars in Indo-European religion, right, who have drawn parallels between, say, Rudra in the Vedic tradition and Woden in the Germanic tradition, or Vishnu in the Vedic tradition and Vidar in the Germanic Norse tradition, right? So for all you know, the gods that we worship in modern Hinduism, they have Indo-European roots, deep Indo-European roots, and without necessarily much linkages to the IVC religion, right? So we have to keep that in mind as well. There's no reason to believe that the Indo-Aryans basically adopted the religious landscape of the IVC civilization which they encountered. Right? For all you know, the Vedic religion has very deep roots in the steppe, right? With strong commonalities with other Indo-European cultures, without much influence from IBC. That's also a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, that's a possibility. I mean, when we get into, I mean, again, IVC, the thing is, we don't know anything about it, right? We have, again, material evidence of maybe possibly what would have been religious motifs, or maybe not. Maybe the Pashupata seal was just a seal used to indicate a gym. I don't freaking know, right? We have no idea what the seal was purposed for, and we don't know. We don't have like any ritual tools that we find or remnant to indicate whether they were worshiping via fire or worshiping via like
Some have
material
alleged that
idol.
there were fire altars. Actually, Michael
Yeah,
Tanino has alleged
I
that
know,
there were fire altars in some places. I think Lothal or
and maybe
Turtokat.
yeah, but again, like my contention on these points is, and maybe we should have Michael Danino at some point on the podcast. But I do think that what we're having is we see a fire altar or we see a fireplace, and it could have been a communal fire place where people gathered around to tell stories, to have communal events, as opposed to religious significance. I think it's always difficult to parse out what is religious and what is
Hmm.
not, because sometimes traditional like community bonding events are secular in nature but appear to be religious because we assume religion to be the foundational element of every society.
Right.
Yeah.
Uh, the so-called mother goddess figurines, though, are like very numerous in IVC sites, and they are attested in many other cultures in the European Neolithic as well. So they actually may go back to like a long time before. Typical figurines with large hips and slender upper torsos. So they
Sure.
like
Sure,
most
but I think
scholars
it's
agree
I
that
think
they
it's
are.
safe to say I think it's safe to say that this is another area about IVC where it's more in the realms of speculation instead
Yes.
of us having any concrete evidence or anything that still continues or something that can be traced back to specifically to IVC. Sure, sure. So, what we'll do is now we'll wrap up this episode. But what I'll request my speakers to do is share with us the references that they've used as part of these conversations. And what we'll do is we'll post them as links to the episode notes. So we're talking now, Shrikant. When do we sort of say this is where broadly IVC ends and the post IVC historical period of the subcontinent starts? What would be the timelines like?
We see the abandonment of cities around 2000 to 1900 BC, at around that time, right? But late Harappa is, I think, probably a poorly understood area in academia as well, in part because even if there were major shifts in settlements to the east, right, to the Gangetic Plain, that is not fully understood by us at this point. In part because there's been very little excavation effort, right? Because we are talking about the Gangetic Plain here, which is one of the most densely populated regions in the world, right? Even Rakhigadi, which is a major IVC site, it has only been partially excavated, right? And if you go further east to western Uttar Pradesh, to central Uttar Pradesh, right? It's possible that there are late Harappan sites in those regions, but we don't know. So far, we haven't seen any excavation. It's very unlikely that you're going to see excavations in regions where you have 1,000 people living per square kilometer, right? That's probably the most densely populated part of India. And and that's why it's very unlikely that we'll ever fill that gap with respect to how the late Harappan phase evolved, right? Uh, yeah.
Yeah,
Gaurav,
I
would you
mean,
like to add anything to that?
I think Shrikant, I think you're right, because one of the problems, and this is, I think, a very big problem in Indian archaeology, is that much of the ancient sites that we're looking to find are probably buried between underneath currently living sites. People have been probably living in these locations for thousands of years. So there's layer upon layer upon layer of in which they live. Like even I think Rakigari, right? Wasn't that discovered basically by locals who were living near Rakigiri in like a village or a town,
Exactly.
whatever, and they found
Yeah.
these settlements, right? These, but it just happened. It was happenstance, and I think this is a problem across India. It's not a problem, but it's an issue for archaeology. But it's a feature of Indian society is that the locations where we find large numbers of people tend to be locations in which people have always lived for not always but for millennia. So it's probably buried deep beneath the cities and towns and villages that we are currently inhabiting now.
Hmm.
Right, and probably one reason why you have more IVC sites in Sindh and in the Pakistan portion of Punjab is probably because those areas are also relatively less densely populated compared to the Western Gangetic Plain, right? So,
Yeah,
The silt deposit
but
is also a reason actually. Silt is
yeah,
deposited a lot in the Punjab or in the especially in the Gangetic Plain annually, which also
through
causes a
the
lot of,
floods.
yeah.
Yeah, and but the thing to also remember on this is that while we have these enclaves of people living in these places and for vast numbers of time and topographies of these of the land changes, we also kind of have to partially remember that the Indian climate destroys things pretty quickly. And on top of it, I think when we talk about sites in IVC, I think there's like something like 14 or 1500 sites found, of which like 1,000 of them are found in India, right? Like maybe 400 or 500 are found in Pakistan and Afghanistan total, and the rest are found in India in populous regions. So I don't know. Some thoughts.
Right. That, no wonder there is a reason we call it uninterrupted civilization, right? With that, we conclude the episode on IVC. As part of the episode notes, you will find the list of sources that our speakers have referred to. Please share your thoughts and feedback. Our next episode will be on the Vedic Age. We look forward to presenting it to you soon. Thank you.
Tune in next week for Brown Cat.